Welcome to the Book of Mormon Evidence Podcast with host Rod Meldrum. This week's Come Follow Me supplemental study is Lesson 48, Moroni 7 through 9. May Christ lift thee up. This is part 1 of the Palmyra Legacy with Bean Henderson, who has spoken for many years at the Firm Foundation Expos and who has shared the story of the great Willard and Rebecca Bean, who served the longest mission in modern-day church history. Lori is the granddaughter of Willard and Rebecca Bean, the first missionaries called to Palmyra in 1915. She enjoys telling the extraordinary stories of their 24-year mission living in the Joseph Smith home and Willard's research of the Book of Mormon lands in upstate New York. To keep this significant piece of church history alive and to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of their mission call in 2015, Lori wrote and produced the DVD documentary, Love Unfeigned. Lori is also following in the footsteps of her grandfather Willard, who studied naturopathy in the late 1800s and lived an exemplary life of physical fitness. Lori is a certified energy healing practitioner and nutrition specialist and advocates a holistic and sensible approach to health and happiness. She enjoys yoga and Tai Chi, being in nature, gardening, earthing, traveling, and especially spending time with her children and grandchildren.
Welcome everybody to another edition of the Come Follow Me supplemental materials. We are hoping that you have gone through the lesson. This is going to be lesson number 48. And I have with me today, I have my dear friend Bean Henderson. And she is a direct descendant of Willard Bean. And if you don't know who he is, you will by the time we're done. He is an amazing individual from early church history and so forth, and was instrumental in actually bringing to pass some of the things we're going to be talking about today as we go through lesson number 48. So this has been a real pleasure. I've been wanting to have this interview with you since really the beginning of the year. We started Come Follow Me, because when it comes down to it, the one place, the one thing that pretty much everybody should be able to agree on, as far as the Book of Mormon and where it took place, is this Hill Cumorah. It's pretty hard to get around the fact that the plates, the gold plates, happen to be found there. And we are so grateful that we have the Hill Cumorah, that we actually can go there and be on the same grounds and so forth that happened. And that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for your wonderful ancestors.
Yes.
So folks, we're gonna dive into this. I'm excited about this. So this is basically we're in Moroni, and we're going to be starting here with chapter 7. So this is on page 497 in the annotated Book of Mormon, which of course is our reference material for these podcasts. And so chapter 7 starts off with it's Moroni, and he's actually doing some words from his father Mormon. So these are apparently he's actually remembering the things that his father taught, and this particular part of it has to do with hope, faith, and charity. In chapter 7, verse 4, it says, "And now, my brethren, I judge these things of you because of your peaceable walk with the children of men. For I remember the words of God, which saith, By their works ye shall know them." I love that peaceable walk with the children of men, and that reminds me. There's in the annotated Book of Mormon, we have a quote here from President Howard W. Hunter, and he said this. He says, "Your peaceable walk with the children of men, let us follow the Son of God in all ways and in all walks of life. Let us make him our exemplar and our guide. We should at every opportunity ask ourselves, what would Jesus do? And then be more courageous to act upon the answer. We must follow Christ in the best sense of that word. We must be about his work as he was about our fathers. To the extent that our moral powers permit, we should make every effort to become like Christ." And as I ponder and think about what I have been able to learn about your grandfather and your family and yourself even, and your wonderful husband Matt, we've got to give Matt here credit as well. I think this peaceable walk with the children of men, and by their work you should know them, really exemplifies how I look at your grandfather, Willard Bean, and this peaceable walk. And I know that there's been, as I've learned more about him, what an amazing individual, and we're going to talk more about that in detail.
One word that jumps out at me too is to be more courageous. And that definitely was necessary when they were in Palmyra in a hostile environment.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're gonna get into more of the actual Willard Bean story. There are things here that you're going to be able to that you won't have heard anywhere else that when we share this. Now, just for information's sake, though, those of you who don't know, Lori has spoken several times actually at our different conferences. So we have her and some more full content, more time and so forth to kind of flesh out these stories. Are available on the streaming website, so that if you go to Book of Mormon Evidence Streaming, if you are subscribing to that, then you can access some of those wonderful things there. But this is going to be kind of more of an overview, but there's some really special things, and Lori was just telling me before we started the podcast here that there's some things that you're going to share with us that pretty special.
Yeah.
And so
the more sacred things that I usually don't share with general audiences. So
yeah. So we're excited about hearing some of those things. So if we go just a little bit further here in chapter 7, it says, verse 10, I love this. I've always liked this, that the particular scripture says, wherefore a man being evil cannot do that which is good, neither will he give a good gift. For behold, a bitter fountain cannot bring forth good water, neither can a good fountain bring forth bitter water. And in fact, he goes on here to say, over here in verse 15, how we can know and how we can judge between good and evil. And it really comes down to by their fruit, by their works. Mm-hmm. You can know them. He says, the way to judge is as plain as it is from daylight is to the dark night. Okay, so he says, the Spirit of Christ is given to every man that he may know good from evil. We're expected to be able to know the difference between good and evil. And he says, for everything which inviteth to do good. So this is kind of the important things. Okay. Inviteth to do good, persuade to believe in Christ, sent forth by the power and gift of Christ, wherefore ye may know that with the perfect knowledge it is of God. So those are the kind of the criteria. Mm-hmm. If it invites to do good and believe in Christ, and it's sent by the gift and power, or the gift of Christ, basically, then you know it's good and with a perfect knowledge. Mm-hmm. But whatsoever thing persuadeth men to do evil, and to not believe in Christ, and deny him, and serve not God, they may know with a perfect knowledge that it is of the devil. So as I look at the works of your grandfather, and even of your own life, I see just so much good, and so much sacrifice, and so many things that were difficult, and that they had to overcome. Mm-hmm. But overall, I see such a blessing. How your family has blessed the lives of so many people is just really pretty amazing.
It is amazing. Yeah.
Kind of feels good to be from that, huh?
Yeah, it's an honor.
Yes. Now, a couple of more things before we're going to jump into some things about the Hill Cumorah. So I think what we're going to, kind of the plan is we're going to talk about some things about the Hill Cumorah. I know that there are groups who are out there even doing Come Follow Me study things about the Hill Cumorah, New York. Well, that's not really the real Hill Cumorah. The real Hill Cumorah is down in Central America someplace. The Hill Cumorah up in New York is just kind of a symbolic thing. I think we're going to try to lay that to rest using the words of the prophets and Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery and so many others who have testified over and over and over again, along with your grandfather, that the Hill Cumorah in New York was the actual and true hill of both the Jaredites, which they called it originally Ramah, right, and the Nephites, which called it Cumorah. We want to see by their works how this all comes together. So in verse 26 of chapter 7, it says, and after that he came, men also were saved by faith in his name, and by faith they became the sons of God. And as surely as Christ liveth, he spake these words unto our fathers, saying, whatsoever thing ye shall ask the Father in my name, which is good, in faith, believing that ye shall receive, behold, it shall be done unto you. I can't think of very many people who probably put that to more good work or to more of a test than your grandfather. Who was asked to do some pretty, well, in fact, let's just take just a second because we're kind of, some people may not be really aware of what happened with your grandfather, but tell us just a little bit about how this all started with your grandfather and his love for Palmyra, New York.
Okay. Well, there's a whole backstory to what prepared him for this mission.
Exactly.
But you want the backstory?
Yes.
Right now?
Right now. Let's do it.
Okay. One of these previous lessons, it was actually one of the questions was, what experiences have you had that have led you on the path, prepared you for what the Lord wants you to do, for your purpose in this life? And so we see that in Willard's life. From the time he was a young boy, he and his brother were herding cattle for the church. And they lived down in Richfield, Utah. And so every summer they'd herd them down from Salt Lake, and in the fall they'd herd them back up, or vice versa, and I can't remember which. But anyway, they had to herd them back and forth. And it was a long trek, but he was just a little boy when he started becoming familiar with the brethren of the church, the leadership of the church.
So he was rubbing shoulders with them because of these cattle drives.
That's where it really started. And then when he was 18, the presiding bishopric was going down through Arizona, New Mexico, into Mexico to visit saints in the outlying areas. And he was hired to be their camp caretaker. And so he went with them on this trek. And, there was horses and, they didn't have cars
wagons
back then. Yeah, wagons. Yeah.
Didn't hop in a plane.
Yeah, so he went with them. And he rolled out his sleeping bag every night under the stars with these leaders of the church, and he learned a lot about the gospel in that experience. And they were gone for about a year that he did that. So he was 18 then, got to know them. And then when he was 20, what was the next thing? He was called to be a missionary in the temple. It was a mission, but he was an ordinance worker. No, this was in the Manti Temple.
Okay.
And let me back up. I need to tell you when he was born. Because he is my grandfather, but he could be my great-great-grandfather with the age difference. But he was born in Provo in May of 1868. When he was 7, they moved down to Richfield. But so 1868, that was 3 years after the Civil War ended. Ulysses S. Grant was elected the 18th President of the United States that year. And Brigham Young was the prophet. Willard was only 8 or 9 years old when.
How old are you again? No, just kidding. Don't tell us.
I'm old enough
to know not to answer that question. Okay,
the question is, how young are you?
It's true.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, so Willard was 8 or 9 when Brigham Young passed away. So that kind of gives some perspective of how far back we're going here. We're still in the 1800s when I'm telling you these stories. So then he was called to be an ordinance worker as a missionary in the Manti Temple. And Daniel Wells was the temple president. He was old and feeble. And so Willard part of his assignment was to take care of the temple president. So he lived in the temple, and he took care of the president, and he was an ordinance worker. There's an interesting story with this.
24 years old at that point?
I think he was 20.
20 years old. Wow.
And so he holds the record for the entire church of performing the most baptisms at one time. He did 400 baptisms, and while he was doing those, more records came in from Salt Lake. 700 more names to be done. Without getting out of the font, he continued baptizing. So he did a full 1,100 baptisms in one day.
One time.
Yeah, and then his coworkers in the temple said, that's pretty rigorous. And so they said
he was blessed with a pretty strong. He was a pretty strong guy.
Athlete,
so we'll talk about that in a minute. Yeah.
So anyway, his coworkers in the temple told him to take the afternoon off and just rest, but true to his nature, he went out and played baseball the rest of the afternoon. So that's just kind of a fun thing to know about him.
Yeah.
And it was in the temple, he says, that he really became a student of the scriptures and really started learning the gospel and gaining a testimony of the gospel because he spent so much time in the temple. That's, quite a place to get your education.
That's the best place of all.
So, yeah. So, and then after that, he thought his missionary work was done, and he had just barely been released from that temple assignment when he got another letter calling him to the Southern States Mission, specifically Tennessee. What's interesting about this one is he was called as a replacement for 2 missionaries who had been killed by the Mormon-hating mobs. Yeah. So he went into a hostile situation at that point, and didn't faze him. they'd often find notices tacked on the trees that, telling the
Mormons be shot on sight kind of thing.
yeah, and, get out of town. And he would just tack notices on top of those saying, we're here to,
To preach.
talk to preach to anybody, anytime, on any subject, So anyway, that was pretty interesting. Do you want me to tell a mission story right now?
He was very courageous. Yes,
he was.
Yes.
He was courageous. Yeah. He was courageous. I have a prop to go with this story.
Oh.
So in the southern, he served in the Tennessee mission with George Albert Smith. His mission president was J. Golden Kimball. And so many stories, so many mission stories, but I'll tell you my favorite.
Okay.
So one day he and his companion it was a hot day, and they went into the town square to get a drink at the fountain, and the people recognized him by the way they were dressed, so they wouldn't give him any water. So undaunted, Willard then just started passing out tracts. And then this big bully comes out, and he says, and he was like, 6'6", weighed well over 200 pounds. He comes out with his buddies, and he says, he wants to beat up on him, get him to leave. Yeah. And so he says, if we whip these preachers with hickory withes, they'll remember us a long time. So Willard stepped forward, and he said, how about we make this a sporting deal, just you and me?
Now tell me a little bit about your dad, your grandfather. So how big was he?
Oh, yes. He was only about 5'9", and he weighed about 160 pounds. So this is like David and Goliath.
He was a small scrapper kind of guy.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, he says, let's make this a sporting deal, just you and me. He said, if you lick me, we'll leave. If I lick you, we get to preach. So he goes, oh, yeah, sure. Imagine this preacher.
This guy's like...
Fight. So anyway.
Welcoming it, yes.
So Willard, this is my favorite thing. My father gave me this book. It's Willard's Book of Mormon from his mission in the
Tennessee.
Southern States. Uh-huh.
Oh, wow.
So Willard took his scriptures, laid them on a stump, and said, lay there, religion, while I prepare this man for Mormonism. And then jumped around a little bit, like he didn't know what he was doing, and then he landed a blow that just knocked the guy out. And everybody, all this crowd had gathered, and everybody was just blown away, just so amazed. And the effect it had was that the missionaries gained their respect. Wow, this is so amazing. And so, so that was courageous.
And we don't know. This wasn't just something that he just kind of he had some athletic prowess.
Yes. And
he knew some things, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
He was quite an athlete, actually.
He was.
Where did that come from?
And that actually came after the mission. It's hard to put his timeline together because he didn't add dates to everything.
Yeah.
But he went to. Well, let me finish that story first.
Yeah, finish the story. Yeah.
It's got a cool ending.
Yeah.
So anyway, then the guy comes to, and Willard always made friends. If he had to, defend himself, knock somebody down, he would always
help him back up,
and they became friends. And this big bully guy said, you can preach here anytime in the schoolhouse, and we'll make sure it's packed. So that's how that story ended. But yeah, when Willard was growing up, he was very athletic, and in college he went to Brigham Young Academy, and he won 5 gold medals on, I can't remember what the sports were, but different events. But he was really taken up
in the same track meet or whatever, right? It was the same big event, but he won like 5 different medals in it or something. Is that, if I remember right? I don't know.
I have to search my notes. I'm not sure it's right here. Shot putting was one. I can't remember now what they running, jumping, shot putting, and 2 others. Yeah. Uh-huh. But he was really caught up from a young age. Boxing was a new sport, and he was really excited about that. He surprisingly never had any formal training. I learned in some recent research, he just watched them, and he learned that way. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very smart.
Yeah, and then he spent some time in San Francisco, where he studied naturopathy and physical culture. And there were institutions there where the professionals
So he was
were
never
coming.
coached in boxing?
Well,
really?
this would count, I guess, as coaching, because the professional athletes were at this gym, and they would practice there, and he'd go watch them. And that's how he learned. And then they'd let him in the ring, and of course they gave him
Spar
tips and
with them
stuff.
and
But
stuff,
yeah, so he impressed them enough that they would let him get in the ring with them. And
That's pretty cool.
boxing, yeah. But that was after his mission. So I think he
Yeah.
was pretty much just a natural athlete and
Yeah.
self-taught.
Yeah.
And we don't know, with that experience, we don't know if his companion knew that he was a fighter when he made that deal.
He's about to know.
Yeah. So anyway, but so he was very athletic, and that's how he got into boxing. And interestingly, so it was after his missions and after all this association with the brethren that he told his parents he wanted to become a professional boxer. And they said, well, you go ask the brethren about that. Imagine that, having to ask the brethren, leaders of the church, if you can,
Become a boxer.
Yeah. Anyway, but he did. He went to them and asked them, and they said, well, normally we would say no. But with your knowledge of the scriptures and your friendly way you have about you, we think it will be a good thing. So you go ahead.
Wow.
So
he got the okay.
That many years later,
Yeah.
it turned out to be a good thing.
It was actually a real blessing later on. Yeah.
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 And he used it, I think, mostly to entertain. He wasn't interested in beating people up. He did, however, teach his sons, he said, never pick a fight, but you're going to get in them. So,
especially when you're a smaller guy. I mean, I know because I'm a pretty big guy,
Yeah.
so I didn't have to fight very many people, but I know some of my friends who are smaller, they get picked on a lot, and at least a lot more than I did, because I think people just assumed I could probably, pound them or whatever, But if you're a smaller guy, I mean, you just, back in those days, there was always kind of this picking on people and that kind of stuff, and so you basically either you learned how to take it, or you learned how to defend yourself.
Yeah. So Grandpa taught his sons to defend themselves, and my dad said, he said, so if you're in a fight and you got to defend yourself, just pretend the guy's face is a foot further away than it really is. So my dad didn't, he never said that he got into
Pound
any
his
fights,
teeth into the back of his head? Is that no?
Yeah. So I don't know if Dad ever got into fights, but he was trained what to do.
So all of this experience prepared him for probably the shock of his life.
Yeah, but see, so he had all these missions, plus his exposure with the brethren from a young age.
So this all started to coalesce into basically a calling that was going to change him and his life and the course of his life forever.
Yes. It turned out that more than half of his life he was a set-apart missionary. But some other interesting things about him too. He was a bodyguard during the gold mining boom in Nevada. He was a bodyguard. So he had a lot of skill.
Yeah, clearly he was tough.
Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us about how did the Palmyra connection end? What happened with that?
Okay, so he got married in the late 1800s. No, let's see. Yeah, because they had their first child. He married Gussie D. Feltz. She's young. He met her when he was in San Francisco at school. Mm-hmm. And they got married, and they had 2 children. Paul was born in 1900, and Phyllis was born in 1903, I think. Mm-hmm. Anyway, they lived there for a while. And
where was that again?
It's Northern California.
Okay.
Yeah. He worked there for a while. And then they came back to Salt Lake, and sadly the marriage didn't work out. Had a tragic ending. They got divorced. Willard got custody of the 2 children. And Gussie remarried about 6 months later to a traveling salesman who turned out to be a very abusive man. And 6 months into their marriage, he came home and shot and killed her, then killed himself. It was a gruesome murder-suicide.
Wow.
And it was reported that Willard made all the funeral arrangements, and it was reported that he just threw himself over her coffin and wept, crying out her name.
Wow.
So he loved her, and it was unfortunate that it ended that way. But 8 years later, in 1914, he met my grandmother.
Rebecca.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And in between that time, after he'd been married and before he met Rebecca, there's more experience gained. How the Lord was preparing him for all of this. He and his he hired a woman to take care of the children, so he and his brother could go back to New York. And they had written a play called Corianton, And so they went back there hoping that it would be a hit and they'd make a lot of money. It was a huge flop, and they lost everything. So, but while he was back there, he became very interested in the political rallies, and this was during the Teddy Roosevelt era. And so he'd go to attend these rallies, and one time the reverend that was supposed to give the opening prayer at this rally didn't show up, so they asked Willard if he'd come up and pray. And then another time the senator who was scheduled to speak didn't show up. So Willard spoke in his place. He could speak on any subject just like
Off
that.
the cuff,
yeah.
just like that. Yeah.
I didn't get that gift, unfortunately. But yeah, he was amazing. He knew so much about so many things, and he could just talk about anything. So he was, in religious circles, he was known as Reverend Bean. That's what they called him back there. In political circles, he was Mr. Bean. And then in boxing, he was known as Kid Bean, and then the Mormon Cyclone, and finally the Fighting Parson. So those were his nicknames.
The Fighting Parson.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
wow.
And he was not a world champion. He, as was portrayed in the movie we were talking about, he really, if you look at his boxing record on, I think it's boxnet.com, it has all the boxing statistics, and his career was not very long, and he was the middleweight champion of Western Utah. Oh. So, he was, and he did a few meets in, I don't know what you call them, boxing.
Tournaments,
okay.
Tournaments, yeah, probably.
In Denver, and he did some in California and San Francisco. Yeah. Most of them were here in Utah, and he won about half. So, I think we've kind of really blown the boxing career out of proportion. But he was good, and and good enough to serve God in an interesting way.
Interesting things. Yeah, by the way, so you just mentioned the film. So those of you who, probably most of you have either heard of it or probably even seen it, but it's called The Fighting Preacher. Mm-hmm. And it depicts a little bit about this experience that the Bean family had as they went back to Palmyra and so forth and so on. And we're going to talk about a few things about about some of the characteristics and so forth of Willard and Rebecca, and some of the cool things that happened and so forth there. So, but we'll kind of jump into that here in just a couple of minutes. But actually, go ahead.
So
while we're doing it, let's go ahead and keep going with this. So when did he get the call?
After he came back from this big flop in New York, but he still, still it was a worthwhile trip because of what he learned.
It's called Corianton?
Yes.
Well, that right there should give you a clue.
Yeah, it was dreadful. We, at BYU, just about 4 or 5 years ago, they pulled it out of the archives.
Oh,
and
really?
Redid it, I mean, it was quite a project. Uh-huh. And Matt and I went to see it. It was just a one-night thing for film students. And we went to see it, and boy, it was bad. It was bad.
So a screenwrite he was not. Okay.
Right. Okay. He wrote a lot, but that one wasn't a good one. But anyway, so then he meets my grandmother. They got married that fall, and in the spring of 2015, there was a state conference in Richfield. And George Albert Smith, remember they had been in the mission together, George Albert Smith was presiding at that conference. And I'm wondering if I should back up just a little bit. I'm going to back up just a little bit.
Okay.
So it was in 1907. George Albert Smith went back to Palmyra a lot, and he made friends with the man who lived in the Joseph Smith home on the farm. His name was Mr. Chapman.
This is Alvin's home that they made for
right
for
not the log home, but yes, the other home, the frame home.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the church really wanted the property, of course, and so George Albert Smith was trying to make that happen. And finally, in 1907, Mr. Chapman agreed to sell to the church on one condition, that he could stay there until they found a suitable place to move to. So the church thought that was going to be 3-4 months, maybe. Mm-hmm. It turned out to be almost 8 years. So suddenly, now they had the property, and all these years had gone by, and they hadn't given it a thought as to who they would send out there to take care of the farm. And so now back to the state conference. My grandmother's sitting up in the choir seats, and Willard comes in the side door of the chapel, and as soon as President Smith saw him, he stepped up to the mic and said, "Would Willard Bean please come to the stand?" So Willard went up and he said, "I have another mission for you. I'll tell you about it after this meeting." So they met with him after, and he said, "When you walked through that door, the Spirit was so strong, it was as if a voice said to me, 'There's your man.'" Wow. So that's how they got called. Okay, so I've kind of set this up because now we're talking about courage and faith to do the Lord's work. And so let's put this in perspective now, because Willard, at this point, he was...
So what is the calling? The calling is to...
Oh, to Palmyra. So they met with President Joseph F. Smith. He was the prophet at the time. So this is 1915. So they went up to Salt Lake, met with him. He officially called them as missionaries to go back to Palmyra for 5 years or longer. Okay. That was the call. 5 years
and
or
the
longer.
or longer part is in there.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, and then they were set apart, and President Smith told them, "You will find Palmyra the most prejudiced place on the earth," and as far as religion and Mormonism goes. And so they had that warning. And so now, with that, consider this, the situation here. Willard is 46 years old. Rebecca's only 23. And he's had all this experience out in the world on so many different levels. She has never been out of Richfield. She's newlywed, barely pregnant with their first child, and raising Willard's 2 teenage children now. And she's being asked to leave the comforts of home and security, and
place.
And all the members of the church, that kind of support, to go across the country to the other coast to a hostile, hateful environment where she is not welcome. None of them are welcome. So that's the scenario, and it required faith. And courage,
hope.
And patience. Now, President Smith, when he set them apart, he told Willard. He said, when we were determining who we were going to call, we knew it had to be a humble man, a fighting man, a man who knew the gospel, and a man who could make friends. And
so they had to know how to run a farm too.
Yes, yeah. And then he gave them 4 assignments. The 4 assignments were: number 1, make friends. In this hostile environment. Number 2, farm the land. Number 3, baptize converts. And number 4, start a branch of the church. In that order. And so he said, "Willard, I know your missionary spirit, and you're going to want to get out there and start preaching right away. But this is different. You have to be patient. First, make friends." So it took 5 years. 5 years before people started accepting them. When they got there, the people knew they were coming. They knew the farm had been sold. They knew the Mormons were coming, and they were not happy about this. They were ready and waiting for them. They wouldn't wait on them in stores. They wouldn't talk to them. Walking down the street, they'd cross to the other side. They'd pull their children, their dogs away. They wouldn't wait on them in stores. Again, horse and buggy days.
They wouldn't even sell them stuff. They refused to sell them things in some cases.
They had to
go to another buy so they could even buy supplies and goods.
Yeah. And then when people drove by the farm, they just yell obscenities at them, scream at them, tell them to go home. We don't want any Mormons here.
Any dang Mormons here.
Yeah. And so it was, it was not a pleasant, was not a pleasant welcome at all. And
some of that's actually depicted in the film too. I mean,
yes.
in the film about just the groups would come over and I mean with guns and everything, and basically and literally were like going to threaten to have make them leave and so forth, and they said we're not leaving.
Yeah. Well, so shortly after they were there, 3 men showed up at the front door, and Willard opened the door and invited them in, and they said, "No, Mr. Bean, you come out here." And so he stepped out, and this is portrayed in the movie, and they were ministers. But they had a meeting. This wasn't a ministry. They had a meeting representing the town.
Yeah.
And so they said, "We've been sent out here to tell you people we don't want you here," to pack up and leave. And Willard said, "Well, I'm sorry to hear that. We came out here and hope to make friends and be an asset to this community. So I'm telling you, we're here to stay if we have to fight our way. I'll take you on 1 at a time or 3 at a time. We're here to stay." So they fled. They never heard it from them again. But there was another time where a group had been to a ministerial convention.
Yeah.
It seems so ironic.
Yes, this isn't it.
So these ministers, it was a whole bunch of ministers, and then they had some school teachers with them, 3 school teachers. And they showed up on the door, and they said, we've been here for this ministerial convention, and we thought we'd come out here and learn a little about old Joe Smith and so on. And so this was actually my grandma's experience. She was home alone. She dreaded answering the door, but they kept knocking. So she had her new baby on her arm, just a few months old, and she opened the door, and they said who they were, and they wanted to learn about old Joe Smith. And she always said they always called him old Joe Smith, and she felt like it was to belittle him. So anyway, she invited them in, and she started telling them, this is the room where Joseph brought the plates. Here's the hearthstone where he hid them under the hearthstone. And they started yelling and screaming questions at her, never waiting for an answer. Her baby was crying. She'd never been in a situation like that in her entire life. And she knew she had to pray, and she didn't know how. She said, I don't know how to pray in a situation like this. But she did. She prayed deep down in her heart. And all of a sudden, a haze came into the room. And it was very quiet, very different and still. Everybody, still. And she said, and then I felt someone standing beside me to help me. And she was able to go on and tell Joseph's story and defend him. And they listened. Then she took him upstairs and showed him the prophet's bedroom and showed them around. And then they came back down, and she invited him to sign the guest book, and many of them did. And then many of them actually apologized for their behavior and thanked her for what she had told them.
Yeah.
And then they left. And she says, she wrote, she said, I sat down in my rocker, and I was rocking my baby back to sleep. And she said, I just pondered on this amazing feeling that came into the room, and the knowledge and the feeling of someone standing beside me to help me. She said, after that, I knew the prophet Joseph Smith. She said, we felt his love and his influence all the years that we lived there. Even her children felt it. And she said, to us he was Joseph, not old Joe, but Joseph. And she said, and when my children said his name, they said it tenderly.
With respect. Well, it kind of reminds me, this is in verse 37 here. Again, this is Moroni chapter 7, verse 37. It says, behold, I say unto you, he basically is asking the question, have angels ceased to appear? This is in verse 36. Or have angels ceased to appear unto the children of men? Or has he withheld the power of the Holy Ghost from them? Or will he, so long as time shall last, or the earth shall stand, or there shall be one man upon the face thereof to be saved? Behold, I say unto you, nay, it is by faith that miracles, like you were just describing, are wrought, and it is by faith that angels appear, or Joseph in this particular case, and minister unto men. Wherefore, if these things have ceased, woe be unto the children of men, for it is because of unbelief, and all is vain. So
let me add to that story, because when I was on my mission in Germany, many, many years ago, 1980, 79, I had my grandmother's fireside talk. It's all printed. In fact, I have it with me. Anyway, so I had taken it to one of our investigators. She was an old woman she was a young woman in her 70s. And we're getting closer to those ages now. It's like, okay.
And
so I took it, my companion and I went to her home, and I asked her if she would help me translate it into German. So she did. And when we got to that story, my grandmother tells that story in this account. And when we got to that story, when it was she prayed deep in her heart, and all of a sudden a haze came into the room, we had the very same experience in this investigator's home. It just suddenly was so quiet and so still, and you just felt this spirit just flood into the room. It was amazing. She felt it. My companion was in another room studying, and she looked through the door like,
what's going on?
What's going on? And that spirit stayed with us the entire time we were with her that day. Yeah. And she actually was later baptized, I think, from that experience. I think that was a witness to her.
That is awesome.
It was beautiful.
That is awesome. So then they get the calling. They move there, and then this is for 5 years. He's only going to be for 5 years or longer, he said. So what happened?
Well, it took 5 years before people would even start talking to them.
Well, the kids couldn't even go to school, I guess, or something.
Well,
What was
okay,
the
I'll
deal
tell
with
you.
that?
My dad. This was 1924 when my dad started school. He was 6 years old. He was the second child born there. My Aunt Palmyra was the first. It's a funny story.
Palmyra,
So she was born. Yeah, she was born in 15, the year they got there. And my grandpa wanted to name her. Wanted her to name her Palmyra, but he wanted that to be the middle name. He wanted her first name to be Ima Palmyra Bean. But Grandma wouldn't go for that, so they dropped
Palmyra Bean.
They dropped Ima, and her name was Palmyra Bean. We called her Aunt Pal, so when we're talking, and they refer to her as Aunt Pal. But
That's pretty good.
yeah. So she was the oldest child of Willard and Rebecca. They had the other two still there, but this was their child. And then my dad was born 3 years later. So when he started school, he was 6 years old. They didn't have kindergarten. He went right into first grade. And when he arrived at school, he found his desk screwed to the floor in the back of the classroom. Because now this is different than the movie. It was portrayed as my Aunt Palmyra. And as far as I know, in the records I've read of her, she never mentioned her early days of school. And I asked my dad, did this happen to Aunt Palmyra? And he said no.
It happened to him.
It happened to him. And he said, we boys got the brunt of the bullying, but all of them had to endure having their lunches stolen and their, galoshes and all these things. They took a lot from the other kids. But anyway, so my dad's first day of school, he goes to school, and the parents had sent notes to the teacher that they would not allow their child to sit next to that Mormon boy. So he was away from all the other students, only 6 years old, imagine that.
Sequestered by himself.
Yeah, but he just went along with it. It's extraordinary how the skill they had to have in raising their children in that kind of environment as well, and keep them, teach them to be loving and kind and forgiving. That's what they grew up with. So anyway, he said after a few months, he said it didn't seem to be too long, he went back to school, and his desk had been moved in with the other children. And he felt like it must have been more embarrassing for the teacher and the other kids than it was for him. So, it wasn't just Willard and Rebecca who had lessons to learn there, but the children as well had to learn.
And also the teacher.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Dad mentioned that. He said when these other kids were teasing him and bullying him and stuff, they didn't get any support from the teachers. They just let it happen. So that was the conditions back then. Did I answer your question? I
Yes.
don't remember what your question was.
Yes, well, we're going to get into more about, because we're going to get into the Hill Cumorah stuff, and how that all came to pass, and how this mission by Willard Bean actually ultimately culminated in the church actually becoming the owner and being able to purchase the Hill Cumorah. And how important this Hill Cumorah is here as we finish up the last couple of chapters in this great monumental history. The Hill Cumorah plays a really critical part in this, in not just in the Nephite civilization, but also in the Jaredite civilization, and also in church history. So this point, this Hill Cumorah is so critical that we understand that. And I was just going to touch on just a couple of last things here and then we're going to jump right into the Hill Cumorah stuff. But basically, so I love this chapter 8. This is Mormon's epistle basically to his son Moroni, where he expresses his love for his son. And I just love that so much. He says, I'm mindful of you always in my prayers. And isn't that kind of typical of a good parent? As to keep them in their prayers, continually praying unto God the Father in the name of his holy child Jesus Christ, or says Jesus, that he through his infinite goodness and grace will keep you through the endurance of faith on his name to the end. I mean, what a wonderful parent. And what a special relationship that these two had together as you see him pouring out his heart. I mean, he can't really be with Moroni at the time.
Yeah.
He's actually out fighting other battles right at the moment. And so forth. He says, I hope to be able to see you again, but just in case I don't,
Right.
know.
Incomprehensible
Yeah.
circumstances going on back then.
Yeah.
I'd like to, at the end of our conversation, I'd like to read my grandmother's last letter to her children.
Yeah. And I hope that maybe that's something that we also kind of consider. What is the legacy that we leave for our own children? I mean, this is the legacy that Mormon is leaving for Moroni. Moroni then gives us his legacy basically in the last chapter in chapter 10
Right.
of the Book of Mormon. And each of us have a legacy to leave. And so I'd love to. I'm excited about hearing about your grandmother,
My grandmother's
grandmother's
final words. to
final
her
words
child.
and so forth.
So stay tuned.
And maybe some of yours too, if you have something that you'd like to share there. So anyway,
Yes.
Then it goes into about the little children need no repentance. We know about those kind of things. And then in verse 27 of chapter 8 of Moroni, he says, "Behold, my son, I will write unto you again if I go not out soon against the Lamanites," because he doesn't know if he's going to be. He may be killed at any point.
This whole thing, this is just so tragic, and I just cry as I get to the end of this book. There's so much good and so much wickedness.
Yeah, but this is, I think, especially apropos for our particular day and time.
Yes.
It says, "Behold, the pride of this nation, or the people of the Nephites, have proven their destruction, except they should repent."
Yeah.
So now this apparently has not happened yet, but he's basically saying that the Spirit's telling him that their nation is never going to come back. It's going to be forever. It's going to be destroyed. He says, pray for them. Even though I love this, because even though he knows they're not going to make it through this time. They have wandered too far off the path. They have gone beyond the point of return. But he still says, pray for them anyway.
Yeah.
He says, "My son, that repentance may come unto them. For behold, I fear lest the Spirit hath ceased striving with them, and in this part of the land they are also seeking to put down all power and authority which cometh from God." Or just lock them out of their churches so they can't, actually worship.
Yeah.
But they can go to the liquor stores and so forth, and that kind of thing. That's fine. They are denying the Holy Ghost, and after rejecting so great a knowledge, my son, they must perish soon.
And yet, we're going to pray until the very end.
Yeah.
Just don't give up hope.
We're going to keep going. Now, the second epistle that Moroni receives from his father Mormon is one that I'm going to talk about a little bit in the next couple of podcasts here. So I'm not going to go into that right now, but basically he's describing how the debauchery that was going on among the Lamanites, and he's describing some of these just awful, wicked things that are going on among the Lamanites. And he says, but you know what? It's even worse among the Nephites. The Nephites have even gotten worse than the Lamanites are.
How did this happen?
and then he goes into his farewell, Mormon's farewell to his son, and again we're going to cover that a little bit more next. The next one as we talk about chapter 10. Now, there was a couple of things though that you mentioned about in chapter 10, just talking about the testimonies.
Yeah, just that it was Moroni's final words to us.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to share some final words from my grandparents.
Okay. All right,
so we'll do that at the end, I think.
So we're going to do that at the end. So I want to take, Joe, just a few minutes here and switch a little bit of gears.
Okay.
So your grandfather, he served how many years then? There in
Palmyra, 24. Yeah. They were called. This is interesting. They were called for 5 years or longer.
And served for.
And in fact, I have the letter right here.
Okay. Yeah. Tell us. What is that letter?
I'm
so what is this letter
to have
now?
this is the letter that my grandmother wrote to my mom and dad when they got their release. It goes into personal stuff too, but so they were called for 5 years or longer. It was 24 years later that they received their release. And my grandmother always said, I left as a newlywed and came home a grandmother. So, so my Aunt Palmyra had already been married and had a baby. And they were living in Utah. All the kids came back to Utah and went to, what was it called then?
Peabody Academy?
No, in Logan.
Oh, Utah State.
It was the agricultural college back then.
Yeah.
So that's where they went. And so my dad had just gotten married not quite a month before this letter came.
Wow.
So she says, I was so happy for both of your sweet letters. I have a big surprise for you. Or perhaps you have heard, news travels fast. We received our release today. Or should I say transfer to Salt Lake City, where Dad will work at the Bureau on the temple grounds. So, and then it goes on. But it's her hand. It's the original letter. I just feel
The
privileged.
original letter. That's so cool.
Yeah.
Here, hold that up so we can see
Oh.
it. Maybe,
Okay.
right, hold that up right there.
Oh, okay.
Okay, we can kind of zoom in just a little bit on it there. You can kind of see the original letter there. Is that awesome? Pretty cool. What was the date on that again?
February 6th, 1939.
Oh, February 6th. That's my birthday. Cool.
Is it?
Yeah.
February 6th, 1939.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, I know that there are some stories, and this is all, and this, a lot of that is in the film, but there's a couple of things, though, that I thought were really special. As I've gotten to know, I had the opportunity to meet you and Matt there in Palmyra. Well, I think a couple different times, but this one particular time, we actually got the chance to go into a couple of places there in Palmyra that were kind of important in some of the accounts from your grandfather's history. So, by the way, pull those two history books out.
Oh.
The two. So there's several books here. So I want to point these out. So this is ABC: The History of Palmyra and the Beginning of Mormonism by Willard Bean. So he's talking about his missionary experiences and things.
No,
in that one?
in this one, no, he's not. It was the
more
leaders
of
of the church were just so anxious to have all the information they could get from, what
what's
are
going
people
on
saying
there. Yeah.
back there
Yeah,
about
yeah.
us now and back then. So he collected, he went to, he took my dad and the boys to libraries, local libraries, more often in Rochester, at bigger library, and they would research, just find all this information, and they had to write it down by hand. So my dad would write everything down, and that's, so they gathered all this information. So Willard put this together. It was kind of like, considered a pamphlet for the leaders in Salt Lake to know what was happening back there. And he goes clear back to the very beginning when King somebody in England gave us this land grant over here. It was in the 1600s, and goes on.
It truly is a history, but
Yeah.
starting from A to B to C. Okay.
Yeah. And what I liked about this book, if you're into real estate, you'll really enjoy the beginning of the book. I liked the part where he retold Joseph's story from a different perspective. And he had, some of them are so heartbreaking, but he had quotes from newspapers and stuff, what they were saying about Joseph at the time of the first vision.
Mm-hmm.
Here he was just a teenager, and he had to suffer so much ridicule.
Yeah.
And so a lot
From the
of
mainstream media
yeah.
of the time. Yeah.
So, but it's really Joseph's story, a new look at it. So I really liked that one.
And then this is the Geography of the Book of Mormon. You want to tell us a little bit more about that one?
Okay, he wrote
Which,
this
by
one.
the way, you can get. We have copies of that. You can get on our bookstore. That's this right here. It's the Geography of the Book of Mormon by the In Search of Rama Kamora here. Mm-hmm. And again, this is by Willard Bean and Cecil McGavin.
Cecil McGavin, yeah.
Yeah.
And so that was another thing that beyond the 4 initial instructions, make friends, farm the land. By the way, that farm was 135 acres.
Yeah, it's a big farm.
You knew that,
Yeah.
And they had lots of animals and stuff. Dad said, "I wish my children could have grown up on a farm like that." We're trying to create our own little farm now.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I've seen it.
So-
It's pretty awesome. I don't see any sheep, though.
No, I don't
sheep.
think they're going to do the livestock.
Okay.
We just want to grow food. Anyway, so make friends, farm the land, baptize converts, and start a branch of the church. Well, in addition to that, as these things were being accomplished, Willard was doing lots of research for this book, for the church, and then also Book of Mormon evidence that that's where this all took place. And boy, there's a lot of it that goes back hundreds of years, 200-300 years before the first vision, before the church was even restored, and we had the Book of Mormon. It goes way back.
Yeah.
So it's pretty amazing. So that's what this book is, and this is.
It really
this
is phenomenal.
a
If you
book.
get a chance to get a hold of that book, it was one of the earliest treatises, basically, by somebody who actually lived there and saw it himself with his own eyes and experienced these things, and it really is a powerful thing. Now there's a couple other things you brought over here too. So this is one of my favorite ones right here, and this is called Love Unfeigned: The 100-Year Legacy of the Mission of Willard and Rebecca Bean in Palmyra, New York. So this is
I'll tell you a story.
yeah. Tell us a story about that.
So my
that's awesome.
Yeah, my sister was really the historian in our family. And
That's Vicki?
yeah.
Yeah.
Collected so much information. We've got these 2 volumes here too.
Pull those up so that
hold
people
those
can see
up
that
for a minute?
how big this thing is.
Okay, this is volume 1.
So
You hold that one.
give you an idea of how big this thing
This
is.
is volume
it's a monster.
2.
Okay, volume 2 right there.
Okay.
There we go.
And so she started compiling all the information she could find on him, and she spent decades
This is
searching
like over
libraries.
almost 650 pages long.
Oh, yeah, the whole thing's over that. I think it's 1,100 pages or something.
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah.
sure.
Yeah,
Anyway,
much.
but she was just researching everything she could find, and she'd go to the genealogy library and the church library and University
So
of
can
Utah
you get
libraries.
these? I mean, are these available someplace?
I'll tell you that too. So, just a moment. So, anyway, that's her life's work. In addition to raising 7 beautiful children, she did that.
Wow.
So, really, she's the historian. And she died 6 years ago from a very rare cancer. And before she died, this
very
was
sad.
kind of getting near the end. She, because she spoke at the conference too.
Yeah,
That's how I was
I got
introduced
to
your
know. In fact, I
conference.
remember one time when the first time I met her actually, and she brought out a whole set of artifacts and so forth from the Hill Cumorah area. I'm like, what? This is awesome! She had all these arrowheads and this and that and the other thing, and it was really pretty special.
Yeah.
Very very cool for her to be able to show that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, she was nearing death, and I was at the hospital with her. Remarkably, she thought that was it, but she did come home and live a few more months. But anyway, this particular time in the hospital, we happened to be alone. Usually there was
Lots of
family and
people coming,
doctors,
yeah, yeah.
And so she pulled me over. She reached out for me, pulled me over, and she said, "I've been waiting to be alone with you." And so I got down really close because she didn't have much of a voice left. So I got really close where I could hear her, and she said, "Will you carry on what I've started? I don't want Grandpa and Grandma to die with me." So inside I'm going, I don't know how I'm going to do this. On the outside I said, I would be happy to. And I didn't know what
That's kind
to
of a
do.
heavy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know
Yeah.
what I was going to do with this. And so then she did go home, and then I would go down. I would spend weekends down there and give her husband a break, and her daughter, who was there most of the time. And so we talked a lot about it. And years before, we had a plan that in 2015 we were going to go back to Palmyra together and celebrate the 100-year anniversary of their call. Well, we knew that wasn't going to happen at this point. Then I had the idea. I remember I was sitting by her bed talking to her, and I said, "Hey, maybe I could get Matt in on this and we could make a documentary." So I called Matt and said, "Can we make a documentary to
By the way,
celebrate
Matt is a
my
videographer
husband?"
and so forth. Yeah.
He worked for the church for many years in the
Yeah.
production department. Anyway, so I called him and he said, "Okay." And so we got it done just in time. And then we went back and we had the books published, also her books that she'd written. And she just
That's
had
the big green books. Okay.
No, not these.
Okay.
But she had written Willard Bean, the Fighting Parson, based on his autobiography. She wrote it as a biography. Mainly, she did that back in 1980 so that her children would have the history. So she kind of, pulled it together. And she just had it in a spiral bound 8.5 by 11, and people were buying those like crazy, even selling them in the bookstore. But we decided to have them formally published like
formal,
this.
Yeah, exactly.
So we did this, and ABC History, and there's another one he wrote. I don't have my original copies of Gospel Conversations is with the publisher right now. It's Boyd. Boyd Tuttle's our publisher. And those are with him, as are, he took these and scanned them so these can be republished.
Okay.
But they're all amazing. And so with all my sister's research, then suddenly just people were sending her letters and calling her with things they knew about Willard. And so it's an amazing compilation. And then one day, and like I said, this went on for years. And one day, the Spirit just said, "This is enough." And so she stopped collecting and put it together. Now, let me just tell you a story about these.
Did she give all the stuff to you then? So you have the collection.
I have,
Okay.
and she's transferred copyrights over to me.
The Spirit's still saying enough?
I think so. Maybe after today, this will be enough. I don't know. So anyway, we made this. We went back to Palmyra for that, for the whole run of the pageant that year, so 2015.
And I think that's when we went out to the.
No, we'd already been on tour at that point. We went on your tour in
right,
2014.
but I met you guys out there separately, and then you took me to the place where the boxing match actually happened.
So I'll get to
we got to talk about that. That was awesome.
Okay, so I'll get to that. So anyway, okay, so in Palmyra though, I never in my life dreamed I would do anything like this, speak or create a DVD or any of this. Yeah. But we went back there. We had our DVD. We had the books published just in time, and we were in the bookstore every day. And we were just dumbfounded at the people who just poured in and came right to our table and said, "I just felt like I was supposed to come in here today." And I was signing books and DVDs and just hearing people's testimonies and how this story
has affected their life,
brought them back into the church or changed their life. So many stories. It was the most amazing experience. And then in the evenings, we had arranged with a woman in the ward back there, Lynn Green. She had worked for the city. She had so many connections. She was so good to us, and she arranged that we could do a fireside every night in the Pliny T. Sexton Bank building, which is a historic building in Palmyra now. Mm-hmm. And in a moment, I will tell you also about Pliny Sexton and how he's part of all of this story. But anyway, so that was really an honor to be able to be. And of course, we hadn't advertised anything, so we just put a sign out on the out on the curb, said, I don't even remember what it said, but Story of Willard Bean, just very brief, 6 p.m. And that gave people time to come hear us and still get to the pageant.
Over to the pageant. Yeah.
So that was the plan. So the first night, a family of 3 showed up, a mother, father, and a little girl. And so we did our presentation. First time I'd ever done this presentation. So then the next night, more people came, and the next night more and more, until the last night. We did, I think, 9 nights. The last night, it was standing room only. Members of the temple presidency were there, ordinance workers, missionaries, townspeople, ward people,
pageant goers.
Yeah. It was amazing. Mm-hmm. I just couldn't believe every night that I was actually doing this, and I was keeping my promise to my sister. I think she should be pleased.
I'm sure she is.
So anyway, that was an amazing experience. So we got to tell about the history there, where a lot of people who live there don't even know all of this now. Mm-hmm. So
I think it was during that time frame when I was there also doing some book signings and so forth at the bookstore there in Palmyra, and then we got together. And then he said, "Well, come on over and we'll show you where this boxing match happened." Now, I got to tell you though that this had such a profound effect on me. I mean, I loved just being there with you guys and knowing what happened there and so forth. And it's kind of just it's like a city building, I guess.
Now it is. It's right across. So we were doing our
just down the street, literally from the Grand Impress. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
so the bank building where we were doing our thing is straight across the street, and there's a city park next to it, and then that's also owned by the banker. So that was one property. And right across the street from that is what is now the city hall. Yeah. And this, the city building. And
I'm not sure how you got in, but somehow you had special keys or permission or something. But we got in.
Well, I'll tell you what. When I was a little girl, the first time I went back, I was 8 years old, and I've been back several times since. But anytime we went back there with my dad, or not even with us. Anytime he was back there, and people, he'd go around to the sites and he'd introduce himself. "Oh, well, you can just have free reign then. We don't need to give you a tour. You can just go wherever you want." And so when we were kids, we got to go through the whole house and everything, without missionaries.
And by the way, this whole thing. I mean, after the 24-year mission was through, and your grandparents moved back to Salt Lake. The people of Palmyra actually basically shut down the whole town and came out to, if I remember correctly, they had like a big get together and everything to thank
Yes, don't go. You're getting way ahead of the game here.
Oh, okay. All right. So go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. When my dad said he was Alvin Bean, and they knew who that was,
Yeah.
so they just kind of let him do what he wanted to do.
Yeah.
When we were there, so in 2000, my dad was 80, and we thought this is a good time. The temple was dedicated, and we thought this is a good time to get as many beans back as we can. So 27 of us went back. Dad took us all around. We recorded him at all these different locations. He was telling about growing
How cool
up
is
there
that?
and the
Oh,
history.
wow.
So we did that, and that's when I learned that City Hall, that city building, used to be the Opera House. And they told us that it had these grand spiraling staircases that on both sides to this beautiful auditorium up there. So, you know what it looks like now. But anyway, so when we went back...
Pigeons live in it, basically.
What, pigeons? Yeah.
Pigeons,
Yeah. So anyway, now I could go in and say, well, I'm the granddaughter of Willard Bean, and so, sometimes I get access.
Yeah.
But, so anyway, they let us go, all 27 of us, and then when we were with you. But they let us all go up there, and you could still see the stage there, but it was covered with birds, and there were holes in the ceiling, and there were boxes, storage boxes all around.
Yeah.
It was just in such disarray. And
Kind of
yet
sad,
when we,
really.
Yeah. And yet when we stood in there and closed our eyes,
Just like
it
you
was
could
like
just
you could hear
imagine it. Yeah.
You could hear the crowds cheering. It was the most amazing thing, and I don't know if that's what you felt, but it was the space of turning hearts.
It was kind of a big turning point, actually, for your
It was. That's
for the
what I
whole
mean.
Bean family and their acceptance into the community and so forth. And I got to tell you, I was pretty disappointed though in the film when it came out. The way it was kind of portrayed in the boxing match was kind of a turning point, but it wasn't the turning point as I understood it. It was actually completely different.
Yeah, he completely switched it
Because
around.
my understanding of it was, and I think you can probably verify this, is that basically, so there was like a 4th of July kind of some kind of a big
No,
celebration or something. They had a big boxing
no,
exhibition is what they were doing.
that's not what it was.
Okay, all right. Well, get us straight here. What happened?
So they were at this point. They were about 5 to 7 years into their mission.
It.
Like I said, it was at year 5 where Willard said, "Okay, I've got to become a little more aggressive here."
Because
getting out.
things are not changing. People
Yeah,
still
things are
hate
not
us.
changing. And by aggressive, that didn't mean with boxing gloves. It meant with words. He started holding street meetings in town, and he was very respectful. We don't want you in our churches and stuff, or we don't want you here. But he did. They started having street meetings, and people would gather. They did it in the intersection of the 4 churches. Well, when they got complaints that they were, blocking traffic, he went to Pliny Sexton and said, "Could I use the park next door?" Because Pliny owned it. And he said, "Yes, and in fact, I'll even let you have the bandstand as a pulpit." So they made some headway there, and people came. They'd, 300 or 400 people, crowds at a time, would come and hear him preach. So that was one inroad. They were hiring, though, anti-Mormon lecturers to come in to, to keep Willard from making any progress. But when the people learned how well versed he was in Scripture, because originally he wasn't allowed to, debate or rebut or anything.
Yeah.
So, but when they learned, they wanted to hear more from him. And he would go to their Sunday school class. He'd go to their churches and sit in the back in Sunday school, and he wouldn't say anything unless they asked him. So he just listened. And they started asking him questions, and they became so impressed with how he could explain the Scriptures so eloquently.
Yeah.
So then they had him start teaching Sunday school in their churches. So that was another inroad. But then, but it still wasn't what Grandpa wanted. And finally he thought, everybody loves athletics. So this was about entertaining, not beating people up. Mm-hmm. This was about entertaining, doing a performance.
Athletic exhibition, basically.
Yes,
Okay.
Boxing exhibition. So he arranged with the Opera House to set up a
Pliny
boxing
Sexton
ring.
owned the Opera House too, didn't he? Then
Probably. He owned about 30% of the town
Okay.
property, yeah.
Yeah.
And so he arranged with them to set up a boxing ring in that big auditorium of the opera hall. And then he invited anyone to get in the ring with him. So I don't know if he anticipated this or not, but the Mormon haters got the biggest, toughest guys from the neighboring towns to come get in the ring.
Because this was actually like advertised. I mean, they're tacking these things up on like the city buildings or whatever kind of thing.
I think so. So anyway.
Sending out text messages to.
Right. Yeah. Wow. So anyway, the night of the exhibition then, it was packed. And the whole front row was filled with these big, tough guys, just raring to get in and, beat up this Mormon.
Knock him for a loop, yeah.
Yeah, and so the first guy gets in the ring, and he just lasted a few seconds. So he
was knocked out?
Yeah, and we say knocked out, but that can mean you just don't get up for a count of 10. So whether they were unconscious or not, I don't know. But anyway, so they took him out, and then the next guy got in, and the next guy. Well, they didn't even last a round.
Yeah, and in between, right, wasn't he like doing some
he'd
like
do a flip
cartwheels or a flip or something because he was so athletically
Yeah.
inclined,
So then the eighth guy wouldn't even get in the ring. So at that point,
I'm not going in there.
So at that point, then Willard drew a 2-foot circle with chalk in the middle of the ring and challenged anyone to knock him out of the circle. And nobody could. He's so agile. Nobody could knock him out. And remember, he's only
Plus, he was quick like a cat, so he just used their force against him and whatever.
He was good. In fact, Dad used to tell me that he could hit a fly on the wall so exact that it would kill the fly and he'd never touch the wall.
Wow.
Amazing. He used to jump teams of horses. He did all kinds of things. So anyway, when nobody could knock him out of the circle, then he did a gymnastics performance to end the show. People loved it. See, the movie tells it.
See, the movie is kind of like
that
he just whooped up on these guys, and they were all just like, "Oh, that dirty, rotten Mormon," and whatever. And he, like, it was a turning point against them. Actually, it was a turning point
in there
for them. They realized what a cool guy he was. I mean, he played by the rules. He whooped up on these other guys.
Yeah.
He didn't try to make him come in, and he gave him, and so forth. And so it was actually a time of when he gained their respect.
He did. Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
What a cool guy,
Yeah.
So anyway, and then let's go back to Pliny Sexton for a moment here. He was the banker. And like I said, he was a multimillionaire. Yeah. And he was known across the country. His degree was actually in law, but he was a banker most of his life. Mm-hmm. And he was a kind old gentleman, but very cold-blooded in business deals. So I'll just say that much for now. We'll come back to that.
Hence, you being a millionaire. Okay.
Yeah. But he loved to help people, but he liked it really to be his own idea rather than people come to him and say, "Will you donate this?" He liked it to be his idea, and so he gave shoes to the needy children every year. And he would plan something like they had a theater. And I don't think they had movies back then. So I'm not, well, they probably had the silent movies. But anyway, whatever they did, he...
probably plays, I would imagine.
Maybe. But anyway, he did the kids could come free in the afternoons, like one day a week. And so after this boxing exhibition, he called Willard in and he said, "I want to do something different for these kids." And so he said, "Could you come up with something?" And so Willard presented, he says, "Well, how about we do a series of classes that would address spiritual education, physical fitness, and self-defense." He said, "Great, let's do it." Reverend Can was supposed to, he would introduce, previously when they had guests, he would introduce them. Well, when now it's a Mormon, he wouldn't get on the stage with one, let alone introduce one. So he didn't show up, didn't faze Willard. He just went on and did his thing. It really, though, upset Reverend Can's congregation, and they drove him out of town for doing that. Anyway, Reverend Can got canned by his own people. So anyway, so Willard did this program, and each week more and more kids came. It was a huge success, huge. And he said that boxing exhibition boosted his stock. He said, boosted my stock in Palmyra 100% plus. It was a huge turning point. I'm disappointed that it was the reverse in the movie.
Kind of portrayed as being a turning point where they turned against him instead. And but that was interesting. That actually how that actually took place and so forth. That's good to kind of get the truth out about that and so forth. That's awesome.
Yeah. So Willard wrote 4 books. Cumorah Land was the 4th one he wrote there, and it was never published. So Wayne May found out about it, and he found my sister, and because Wayne actually, this book, Geography of the Book of Mormon, when he got hold of this, he was so excited. This was really his inspiration to continue researching. Wayne found my sister, got together with her, and they combined Willard's Cumorah Land book with all of Wayne's fabulous information. Yeah. So the two of them edited all this together. There's lots of pictures from Palmyra and my grandparents and so on in here. It's a great book.
It is a great book.
History book.
It is really good. In fact, let's go ahead and play that if we can.
Yeah, I'll just give you, when we were in Palmyra, that time we took you up into the Opera House boxing space. We also caught Wayne and got this interview from him to go on our documentary.
Yeah. So I think that actually the interview was actually filmed in the Ancient America Museum in the Palmyra Inn, which is owned by Stephen Smoot, who was just a couple of weeks ago on the Come Follow Me, on our Come Follow Me. So if you hear that one, that was the hotel that he built and so forth there, and then let us use that space to be able to show some of the ancient archaeology from the area there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was awesome.
A guy named Ron Garf hands me a little teeny book, about this big. I think it's about 94, 96 pages. And it was by Cecil McGavin and Willard Bean on Geography of North America. That was my first real encouragement. Somebody out here is alive besides me. I was sorry to see it was so far back, And I tried to find people. I didn't find anybody from Willard's side, but I found the McGavins, and I talked to them. And that's how I really got started. Just a little bitty book. That was my first real encouragement, was Willard and McGavin's book. From what I knew of the Iroquois nation as a whole, it was very, very accurate, and I love the little snippets of the warfare between the English and the French. I mean, what's really missing today, I feel, in American history, if you just stop at any used bookstore and you get a history book from about maybe 1930 back to even like 1890, and you hold up that history book and like this, you say it's this thick, I'd say probably a fourth of it is the establishment of this country. And in that is some of the best reading you'll have on the whole story of America in its infancy. And that's what your grandfather put in his paper, was that kind of material. And I've been reading this for years, so I mean, for me, I understood what he was talking about. I understood the English politics and the French politics and the Iroquois switching sides back and forth and sometimes splitting their own nation into two, some with the French, some with the English. I understood that. And your grandpa's story, from as far as I'm concerned, he hit the nail on the head. And I just loved it. I mean, I thoroughly loved it. This is not an archaeology book like my first 4 are, but for me, this is probably my favorite book. I love this book. The new period in history that Willard brings up is the very fact that this is the Promised Land. And Willard, without saying those exact words, that's what his message is delivering. And now where we are at today, with all the struggles that we've been doing with archaeology in the church, getting the brethren and really getting academia in the church to look to the east and not look to the south. And I think the big turning point was when the DNA hit. I mean, that was the last straw. Okay, here we are, we have the DNA, we have a Middle Eastern connection, and we've got maybe 1% south of the Rio Grande. But at the Great Lakes, we're running over 50%. I think that says volumes. And I say, yeah. And then you look back to Doctrine and Covenants 32, and where did they go? He went to the Algonquin family, and that's what's at the Great Lakes. It's the Algonquins. And when you talk to the Algonquins, they're one of the coolest things, and I found this out years ago. they will tell you, we came from the East. Now, they'll also tell you, we mixed with those who came from the West, but we were here first. Before I published this land number 5, I had talked to a lot of people about this guy named Willard Bean. I wanted to find out, where was he in the mix? And I found out there was a lot of people that didn't know about Willard Bean. And again, that to me was a serious mistake, because without Willard Bean, there would be no Palmyra today for Latter-day Saints to come back and visit. I mean, really, it's just that simple. And what he did here, and his wife, and the things their family went through, I mean, I read all the stuff. I mean, it was just unbelievable. I mean, this was an unpleasant mission for a very long time, and they put up with more than the average bear. And boy, I really tip my hat to them, and I hope someday that I can meet them.
Yeah, that would be pretty awesome. So that book is called This Land, Willard's Cumorah Land. And that is available on our bookstore and so forth. You can get that also from Wayne and his website as well.
Make sure to listen to part 2 and 3 of the Palmyra Legacy.
To me, this is not just another nation. It is not just one of the family of nations. This is a nation with a great mission to perform for the benefit of liberty-loving people everywhere. It is my firm conviction that the Constitution of this land was established by men whom the God of heaven raised up unto that very purpose. This is part of my religious faith.
Looking forward to 2021, you can buy your annotated Book of Mormons for Christmas gifts and save 21% at bookofmormonevidence.org.